The room didn't just get tense. It shifted. Point one sentence, sharp, direct, and almost impossible to ignore, cut through the hearing like a blade. A sitting member of Congress looked straight at the man leading one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world and asked a question that sounded less like politics and more like a warning. When should I expect the FBI at my door? That wasn't theater. That wasn't routine oversight. That was something deeper, something that revealed just how far the trust between government and the public might have already fallen. Because what unfolded between Madeleine Dean and Kash Patel wasn't just a clash of personalities.
20-word FBI budget request, the so-called skinny, I'll call it Ozempic request, that states that, quote, the undoing of the weaponization of the FBI is one of the administration's top priorities. The weaponization of the FBI that is something that deeply concerns me. It should concern all of us. And yet, since taking office, President Trump has been on a revenge tour. He has targeted individuals, universities, law firms, with executive orders to cut them out or to make them come under his will. He has used ICE to disappear U.S. citizens without due process, and he's fully ignored a unanimous Supreme Court order, and then over the weekend wasn't sure if he was obligated to uphold the Constitution of the United States. In your book, your recent book, Government Gangsters, you include an appendix with a list of names that people have referred to as an enemies list. Now, I know you will claim it's just an appendix, not an enemies list. So let's focus on how the president sees it, on what the president calls it. And you proudly display his quote on the front cover of your book. The president calls this a brilliant roadmap, a blueprint. And I have not even raised your storied children's book, The Plot Against the King. It concerns me how many people from this blueprint have been targeted with executive orders and FBI investigations. The FBI cannot be weaponized, and under your leadership, it has been nothing but a weapon alongside the president to go after the president's perceived opponents, to stifle dissent and free speech. A few weeks ago, as we saw through a social media post that you quickly deleted, the FBI arrested a judge in Wisconsin for correctly asking ICE officials if they had a judicial warrant instead of an administrative warrant, which they did not have. Despite this judge following the law, on the morning of April the 25th, the FBI arrested the judge in an escalation of the weaponization of the FBI under your leadership. Let me be clear. A functioning democracy does not lock up judges. I am gravely concerned about the utter lack of independence of the FBI and its weaponization under your leadership. I am concerned that the president is using this book, your book, as a blueprint, as he has said. It's a blueprint for revenge. And I am concerned that your eagerness, a childlike giddiness to carry out the president's revenge tour, you've shown yourself to be unserious in your statements before you were sworn in and some after. You've shown yourself unfit to lead this important agency. I was an impeachment manager for President Trump's second impeachment. It was a sad, solemn duty. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Mr. Patel, as you and the president continue to weaponize and investigate his perceived enemies, as you follow this blueprint, when can I, a former impeachment manager, expect the FBI at my door?
Ma'am, you want to know who was targeted by a weaponized FBI? Me. You want to know how and why?
Well,
you want to know what I'm doing to fix it?
That. Let me move on.
Well, you should read the
topics.
book because there's no enemies list on that book.
So
there are
you-
people that violated their constitutional obligations and their duties to the American people.
That's good. You
And they
gave
were
them due
rightly
process.
called out.
I'm
And
changing
you should
topics.
give that book to every one of your constituents so they can read about it.
I won't be doing that.
That's their loss.
During your Senate confirmation hearings, you repeatedly denied having any involvement as a private citizen in the firing of FBI officials who engaged in the prosecution against January 6 insurrectionists, the violent rioters who beat and killed Capitol police officers, and whom you referred to as political prisoners. Since then, multiple whistleblowers have come forward, and we know that you likely committed perjury. At the same hearing, you claimed you were not familiar with Stu Peters, an anti-Semitic Holocaust denier despite the fact that you appeared on Mr. Peters' podcast 8 separate times. 8 times, and you claimed not to recall. Mr. Patel, my second question is, should we worry more about your memory or your veracity?
We should worry more about your lack of candor. You're accusing me of committing perjury.
Veracity?
Tell the American people
didn't
how
know.
I broke the law and committed a felony.
You
Have the audacity to actually
No,
put the
all
facts
right, then
forward
the answer is
instead of
both.
lying for political banter so you can have a 20-second
answer
donation hit.
The answer is both. I believe that the
The
men and
answer is
women of
you're
the
failing, not
I
me.
reclaim my time.
Go ahead.
Mr. Patel, I believe that the members of the FBI, and I know many of them, many retired, 38,000 people, as you say, it's a little less than that now, deserve the very best, deserve extraordinary independence, deserve freedom from the fears of being investigated, the freedom of coming forward to make sure they're doing their job. And I'll end with this, that I think it's interesting that in your proposal today, you find yourself at a gulf of difference between you and the president. I wonder how you will resolve that. Will you go to the president and say, we need $11.2 billion, not what you cut out of here? You're asking for more than $1 billion than the president's request. Are you going to go to the president and straighten out that gulf?
I'll do what I've always done and represent the American people, defend this country, and make sure the Constitution is always upheld and the FBI is never weaponized. Maybe you should do the same.
So you agree with the president when he says he doesn't know if he should uphold his constitutional duty?
If you want to just keep putting words in my mouth, the TV cameras are outside.
I thank you. I yield back. Again, this is an unserious moment, sadly, for the FBI. I yield back.
More so for you.
Mr. Strong.
It was a moment that forced a much bigger question into the spotlight. What happens when the people no longer believe the system is neutral? And the way Patel responded only made things more intense. That IT started like many hearings do, formal, structured, almost predictable. But within seconds, the tone shifted. Madeleine Dean didn't ease into her questions. She didn't build up slowly. She went straight for the core issue that's been quietly building pressure across the country. The idea that federal power, especially institutions like the FBI, might be used not just to enforce the law, but to settle political scores. She didn't frame it gently. She didn't soften the language. Instead, she accused Patel of something far more serious than policy disagreements. She suggested that under his leadership, the agency had turned into something else entirely, a tool, not for justice, but for targeting. And then she doubled down. She pointed to what she described as a revenge tour. She referenced executive actions, investigations, and decisions that, in her view, weren't about protecting the country, but about going after people perceived as opponents. Her words weren't just critical, they were personal. She questioned his judgment. She questioned his seriousness. And at one point, she made it unmistakably clear where she stood. She said he was unfit to lead. That's not a line lawmakers throw around lightly. And in that moment, you could feel the weight of it. The kind of statement that doesn't just challenge someone's decisions, but their entire credibility. But here's where everything changed. Because Patel didn't retreat. He didn't deflect in the usual way. He didn't pivot to a generic response. Instead, he did something that flipped the entire dynamic of the exchange. That he made it about himself. You want to know who was targeted by a weaponized FBI? He said. Me. That response landed differently. Because suddenly, this wasn't just one side accusing the other. Now both sides were claiming the same thing. That the system had been used against them. And that's where the situation became far more complicated. Instead of a clear narrative, it turned into a collision of two completely different realities. Dean was arguing that the FBI, under Patel, had become a political weapon. Patel was arguing that the FBI had already been weaponized and that he was fixing it. Same institution, same accusation, opposite directions. And for anyone watching, that raises a very uncomfortable question that if both sides believe they're the target, then what does that say about the system itself? But the tension didn't stop there. Dean pushed further. And this is where the exchange became even more intense. She brought up Patel's own words. His book, Government Gangsters, and what she described as a list of individuals that many have interpreted as political opponents. Now, to be clear, Patel has consistently rejected that interpretation. He said it's not an enemies list. He's framed it as accountability, naming individuals he believes violated their duties. But Dean wasn't convinced, and she made that clear by tying his writings to real-world actions. She suggested that people mentioned in his work were now being targeted through investigations and executive decisions. That connection, whether proven or not, is exactly the kind of narrative that fuels public concern, because it feeds into a bigger fear. That power isn't just being used, it's being directed. And when that idea takes hold, it's hard to shake. Patel, again, didn't back down. He told her to read the book. He insisted there was no enemies list. And then he turned the argument again, saying that those named were people who had failed their constitutional responsibilities. If that's a fundamentally different framing point, one side sees targeting, the other sees accountability. And the gap between those two interpretations is massive. But the exchange took another turn when Dean introduced something even more serious: allegations about Patel's past statements. She referenced his Senate confirmation testimony. She brought up claims that he denied involvement in certain actions, specifically related to FBI personnel decisions, and then pointed to reports suggesting otherwise. Now, it's important to be precise here. These are allegations. They've been discussed publicly, and they've been raised by critics, but they are still contested. Dean framed it as a question of credibility. Should people be more concerned about his memory or his honesty? That's not just a political jab. That's a direct challenge to trust. And Patel's reaction was immediate. He pushed back hard that he accused her of lacking candor. He demanded specifics. He challenged her to present actual evidence instead of what he described as political attacks designed for attention. And just like that, the hearing crossed another line. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It became a battle over truth itself. Who's telling it? Who's bending it? And who gets to decide? But here's the part that really matters. Because while this exchange felt explosive, it didn't happen in a vacuum. Moments like this don't come out of nowhere. They build over time. And if you zoom out, you start to see why this resonates far beyond one hearing. For years, Americans across the political spectrum have been raising concerns about how federal power is used. Different groups point to different examples. Some bring up surveillance programs. Others point to investigations they believe were politically motivated. Some reference actions taken during protests. Others focus on how certain individuals or groups were treated compared to others. The details vary, but the underlying concern is the same: that the system might not be as neutral as it's supposed to be. And that fear isn't entirely new. That if you go back decades, you'll find moments where trust in federal institutions took major hits. Programs like CONTLPRO, where intelligence agencies monitored and disrupted political groups. The Watergate scandal, where presidential power was used in ways that shook the country. Even the post-9/11 era, where surveillance expanded dramatically in the name of security. Each of those moments left a mark, and over time, those marks add up. They shape how people interpret what they see today. So when Dean talks about weaponization, some people hear a real warning. And when Patel says he was targeted, others hear something equally believable. Because both narratives connect to past experiences. And that's what makes this situation so difficult. That it's not just about facts, it's about perception. And perception, once it sets in, is incredibly hard to change. That's why this exchange matters. Because it highlights something deeper than disagreement. That IT shows a country where two sides can look at the same institution and see completely different realities. Point one sees danger. The other sees correction. Point one sees abuse. The other sees accountability. And somewhere in the middle, trust starts to break. But here's the real issue. Because once trust in institutions like the FBI starts to erode, it doesn't just affect politics. IT affects everything. Law enforcement depends on credibility. The justice system depends on legitimacy. And both depend on the public believing that decisions are made fairly, not politically. If that belief fades, the consequences aren't small. They're foundational. And you can hear that concern in the way Dean framed her closing remarks. She talked about independence, about the people working inside the agency, thousands of them, who rely on leadership to protect that independence. And she questioned whether that was still happening. Patel, on the other hand, ended on a different note. That he said he would do what he's always done: represent the American people, defend the Constitution, and ensure the FBI is never weaponized. Same institution, same mission, completely different interpretations of what's happening. And that brings us back to the moment that defined this entire exchange. When should I expect the FBI at my door? That question doesn't just come from disagreement, it comes from fear. Whether that fear is justified or not is something people will continue to debate. But the fact that it's being asked at all says a lot about where things stand. Because in a system built on trust, that kind of question shouldn't feel realistic. And yet, for many watching, it did. So now the conversation moves beyond that room. Because this isn't just about Madeleine Dean or Kash Patel, that it's about what people believe is happening. Behind the scenes, that do federal institutions operate independently, or do they shift depending on who's in power? Is accountability being enforced, or are opponents being targeted? And maybe the most important question of all, if trust is already broken, how do you rebuild it? Because without that trust, everything else becomes uncertain. The Constitution becomes something people argue over instead of rely on. Justice becomes something people question instead of expect, and the system itself starts to feel unstable. That's why moments like this don't just fade away. They stick, they spread, and they shape how people see everything that comes next. So now it's your turn. What do you think is really happening here? Is this a case of necessary accountability or something more concerning? Do you believe federal institutions are being used politically, or is that narrative being pushed for advantage? And most importantly, if trust is already slipping, what would it actually take to fix it? Drop your thoughts below. This is one of those conversations that doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one we need to have. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more deep dives into moments like this, make sure you hit subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. This is your channel for uncovering the moments that matter, where power gets questioned, narratives collide, and the truth isn't always what it seems. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.